In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer in rural Minnesota pulled a flat slab of stone from the roots of a tangled aspen tree. Carved into its face were rows of mysterious symbols, a runic inscription that, once translated, told a story almost no one was prepared to believe. It described a party of Norsemen deep in the American interior in the year 1362, more than a century before Columbus ever set sail. That stone is now known as the Kensington Runestone, and for well over 100 years it has divided historians, linguists, geologists, and amateur investigators into two fiercely opposed camps. Either it is one of the most extraordinary pre-Columbian artifacts ever discovered on American soil. It is one of the most elaborate hoaxes in archaeological history. But here is where the story gets stranger. Some researchers do not stop at Vikings. They follow a thread that leads somewhere far more unexpected, to the Knights Templar, the secretive medieval military order. Vanished from European records in the early 1300s, just decades before the date carved into that Minnesota stone. Could a group of Templar-connected explorers have crossed the Atlantic and pushed deep into North America nearly a century and a half before Columbus? The evidence is disputed, the theories are bold, and the deeper question, the one that keeps pulling serious researchers back to this story, is why so many separate clues seem to point in the same direction. Let's follow that thread. To understand why a stone found in rural Minnesota still sparks fierce debate more than a century later, you have to go back, not just to 1898, but to a world that existed nearly 500 years before that. The Knights Templar were, by any measure, one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They grew into something far greater than a military escort service. Within a few generations, they had become bankers, landowners, and diplomats, a network that stretched from Jerusalem to the Atlantic coast of Europe. They commanded fleets of ships, held castles across 2 continents, and answered to no king. Only the Pope could tell them what to do. That power, however, made them dangerous, and in the early 14th century, the French crown decided they had become too dangerous to survive. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that some historians believe gave rise to the superstition around Friday the 13th, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of Templar knights across his territory. The charges were extraordinary: heresy, blasphemy, and secret rituals too scandalous to repeat in polite company. Whether those charges were true or fabricated to seize the order's wealth is a question historians still debate today. What is not disputed is the outcome. The order was officially dissolved by Pope Clement V in 1312. Its last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. But here is where the story gets complicated. In the weeks before the mass arrests, something happened that has never been fully explained. The Templar fleet, a formidable collection of ships docked at the French port of La Rochelle, simply vanished. No record confirms where those ships went. No inventory of their cargo survives. They were there and then they were gone. Some historians treat this as an administrative gap, the kind of missing record that is common in medieval archives. Others see it as something more deliberate, a fleet loaded with treasure, with survivors, perhaps with secrets, sailing into an unknown horizon before the king's soldiers could reach the docks. This is where fact ends and theory begins. But that disappearing fleet is the thread that, for some researchers, connects a medieval military order to a slab of carved stone buried beneath the roots of a Minnesota tree. And that connection, however speculative, is exactly what makes this story so difficult to dismiss. So what exactly does the Kensington Runestone say? And why does that message, carved into a slab of greywacke pulled from a Minnesota field, keep drawing researchers back decade after decade? The inscription, when translated from the runic script, tells a striking story. It describes a party of Norsemen. The stone specifies a mix of Swedes and Norwegians traveling inland on what appears to be an exploratory journey. The text states that 10 of their men were found dead, covered in blood, on a day they had been away from the camp fishing. It gives a specific year, 1362. and it ends with a note about the survivors leaving behind men to guard their ships at a body of water 14 days' journey away. Those are the facts as they appear on the stone itself. Everything else, who carved it, why, and whether it is genuine, remains deeply contested. The year 1362 is not random. It falls squarely within a period when the medieval world was in turmoil. The Black Death had swept through Europe. The Knights Templar had been dissolved by papal decree roughly half a century earlier, and yet some researchers point out that successor orders, groups that absorbed Templar members, Templar wealth, or Templar maritime knowledge, remained active in Scandinavia well into the 14th century. This is where theory begins to layer onto fact, and it is important to be clear about that distinction. The factual claim is simple. A runic inscription dated 1362 was found in the interior of North America. The theoretical claim, and it is a theory, not an established conclusion, is that the people who made Journey may have had connections to the remnants of the Templar network or to the navigational traditions the Templars helped preserve. Proponents of this theory point to a specific detail on the stone that they find difficult to dismiss. Among the symbols carved into its face, some researchers believe they can identify a marking consistent with what has been called a Templar hooked X, a runic character that, according to this line of argument, was used as a kind of coded signature by groups with Templar affiliations. Forensic geologist Scott Wolter, who has studied the stone extensively, has argued publicly that this symbol appears on the Kensington Runestone, on other artifacts connected to the same broader mystery. Skeptics push back firmly. Mainstream runologists have largely argued that the runic alphabet used on the stone contains forms that did not exist in the 14th century, suggesting the inscription was carved much later, possibly by a 19th century Scandinavian immigrant with knowledge of runic writing. That is the dominant academic position, and it deserves to be stated plainly. And yet the debate refuses to close, because the deeper question is not just whether the stone is genuine, it is why this particular detail, that hooked symbol, that specific year, that inland location, keeps appearing in the evidence whenever researchers pull on this thread. Something carved the stone, someone chose those words, and whoever they were, they left behind a message that has outlasted every attempt to silence it. Here is where the story takes a turn that even the stone's harshest critics have struggled to fully dismiss, because buried inside the Kensington inscription is a single detail that does not fit neatly into either camp, not into the forgery story, and not into the conventional history of medieval exploration. The inscription refers to a party of Norsemen traveling through what is now the interior of North America in the year 1362. But it is not the journey itself that raises the most difficult questions. It is one specific element carved into the stone's edge, largely overlooked by early translators. Concerns a dating notation found on the side face of the stone, separate from the main body of text. Some researchers argue that this notation is not consistent with standard runic writing conventions from Scandinavia in the 1300s. That, they say, is evidence of a forger who made mistakes, but here is where the debate flips. Other linguists and runologists have pointed out that the specific format used actually mirrors a dating system found in certain medieval ecclesiastical records, records tied not to ordinary Norse communities, but to religious military orders operating in Northern Europe during precisely that era. In other words, some researchers suggest the calendar system encoded in the stone is not straightforwardly Viking. It is, they argue, Templar adjacent. To be careful here, this is a theory, not an established fact. No document has been found that conclusively links the Knights Templar to any North American expedition. The order was officially dissolved in 1312, roughly 50 years before the date on the stone, but history is rarely that clean. Templar successor organizations, affiliated networks, and surviving members continued operating across Europe and Scotland well into the mid-1300s. Some scholars of medieval history note that the time frame on the Kensington stone, 1362, falls squarely within a period when remnant Templar-connected groups were actively seeking new territories and new purposes, scattered and stateless after the order's destruction. The detail that does not fit, then, is this. If someone in rural Minnesota in the late 1800s wanted to forge a runic stone, why would they encode an obscure medieval ecclesiastical dating system that almost no one at the time would have recognized? The forgery argument typically rests on the idea that a local farmer or amateur historian constructed the stone from available knowledge, but the calendar notation in question was not widely documented in popular literature of that era. It was the kind of detail buried in specialist academic texts, not the sort of thing a Minnesota farmer would have had any obvious reason to know or to include. That is the question that keeps pulling researchers back, not whether the stone is genuine, but why, if it is a fake, it contains details that are so precisely obscure. So if the stone is genuine, or even if it is not, the question that has quietly haunted researchers for decades is this: where did the idea come from? Who in 1362 or in 1898 would have known enough about medieval Scandinavian exploration, runic dialects, the interior geography of North America, to carve or compose that inscription? And why does the Templar connection keep surfacing every time someone digs deeper into the evidence? The theory that genuinely changed the shape of this debate did not come from a fringe corner of the internet. It came from a forensic geologist, a scientist trained to read the physical properties of stone the way a detective reads a crime scene. His argument was not built on legend or wishful thinking. It was built on weathering patterns, mineral deposits, and the microscopic behavior of rock over centuries. The core of that argument goes like this. If the Kensington Runestone had been carved in the 1890s, as the majority of mainstream scholars long assumed, the freshly cut runes would show a very different chemical profile than the surrounding uncarved stone face. Newly exposed stone weathers at a measurable rate. The calcite and dolomite crystals inside the cuts would look raw and unweathered, inconsistent with the surrounding surface. But according to this line of research, the weathering inside the rune cuts appears consistent with an inscription that is genuinely old, produced not by decades of aging, but by the kind of slow chemical change that accumulates over much longer periods. It is important to be clear, this analysis is itself disputed. Other geologists and runologists have examined the same stone and reached different conclusions. The scientific community has not reached consensus. What this line of research did, however, was shift the terms of the argument. Before, the burden of proof fell entirely on those who believed the stone was authentic. After, skeptics had to engage more seriously with the physical evidence rather than simply dismissing the inscription on linguistic grounds alone. And that is where the Templar theory enters, not as a proven fact, but as a speculative framework. Some researchers find compelling precisely because it answers a logistical question the stone itself raises. If a group of Norsemen truly reached the interior of North America in 1362, they did not stumble there by accident. Deep inland travel of that kind through unknown waterways and hostile terrain would have required resources, organization, a purpose serious enough to justify the risk. Some researchers suggest that the Knights Templar, or successor organizations carrying Templar traditions after the order's suppression, had both the maritime capability and the institutional motivation to mount exactly that kind of expedition. This is speculation. It should be labeled as such, but it is the kind of speculation that keeps this mystery alive, because it is not random. It fits a pattern. And the deeper question is why that pattern keeps appearing in the evidence, no matter which direction you approach it from. So here is where we land, and it is not the tidy ending that either side of this debate would prefer. After more than a century of arguments, excavations, linguistic analyses, and competing theories, the Kensington Runestone remains exactly what it has always been, a question without a clean answer, and that, in itself, is worth sitting with for a moment. The facts, as we can establish them, are these. A stone was found in Minnesota in 1898. It carries a runic inscription. That inscription describes a party of Norsemen and Goths in the year 1362, deep in the interior of a continent that. According to official history, Europeans had not yet reached. Those are the facts. Everything else, every theory, every interpretation, every claim of proof or proof of fraud, falls somewhere between educated analysis and informed speculation. What we cannot explain, even now, is the full picture. If the stone is a 19th century forgery, then someone in rural Minnesota produced a document sophisticated enough to challenge serious scholars for generations, using runic letter forms and dating notations that were not widely published in accessible sources at the time of its discovery. That is not impossible, but it is a remarkable claim in its own right. It demands a forger of unusual knowledge and unusual motive. If the stone is genuine, the implications are staggering. A medieval expedition, possibly connected, as some researchers theorize, to networks that survived the fall of the Knights Templar, penetrated the North American interior more than a century before Columbus set sail. They left behind a carved record of tragedy, 10 of their number dead, the rest pushing on toward the sea, and then they vanished, leaving nothing else behind that history has yet confirmed. Neither explanation is comfortable, neither is complete. What keeps drawing researchers back, what keeps this debate alive across generations, is not just the stone itself, it is the pattern of questions that surrounds it. The medieval hooked X symbol appearing in contexts that some scholars connect to Templar-era documents, the geographical reach implied by the inscription, the persistent sense that the official story of who first crossed the Atlantic may be less settled than textbooks suggest. Those questions are not proof of anything, but they are genuine questions, and genuine questions deserve serious attention rather than reflexive dismissal. The deeper truth may be this: the history of human movement across the globe is far older, far more complex, far less tidy than any single narrative can contain. The Kensington Runestone, whether carved in 1362 or 1898, is a reminder that the past keeps secrets, and sometimes the most honest thing we can say is that we do not yet know enough to be certain. The stone sits in a museum in Alexandria, Minnesota. The inscription is still there, the questions are still there, and the answer, for now, remains just out of reach. If this kind of deep historical mystery is what you're here for, there is plenty more where this came from. The next thread is already waiting.